The wind did not blow in the Arizona territory so much as it scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 dry miles, picking up sand from the Sonora and flinging it against the rough-hewn pine of the ranch house until the wood was polished gray. It was a land that demanded silence, and Daniel Hayes gave it exactly that. He rode his bay mare, heavy with the heat of the afternoon. Along the northern stretch of his barbed wire fence, the sun was a white blister in a sky so pale it looked drained of blood. It was late in the year 1879, or maybe early 1880. Daniel had stopped counting the years with any real care after the fire. Now, time was measured only in seasons of drought, seasons of calving, and seasons of killing. Daniel was a man built for this hardness, mid-30s, though his face looked older, carved from granite and leather. His shoulders were broad, straining the seams of a faded blue shirt that had seen too many washings in alkali water. He pulled his hat low, squinting against the glare, his eyes the color of flint, scanning the horizon not for beauty, but for threats. His knuckles, resting on the saddle horn, were scarred and thick, the hands of a man who had built fences, branded hides, and dug graves. He pulled the mare up as he reached a section of cedar posts that leaned drunkenly toward the canyon. Recent brush fires had licked at the edges of his property, leaving great black scars across the golden scrub grass. The smell of char still lingered, faint but sharp, mixing with a scent of sage and horse sweat. Daniel dismounted, his boots crunching in the dry earth. He checked the wire. It was taut, singing a low, mournful note in the wind. He took a glove off, wiping sweat from his forehead, and reached into his breast pocket. His fingers brushed the edge of a photograph, folded and worn soft as cloth. He did not pull it out. He knew the image by heart, a woman with laughing eyes and a small boy sitting on her lap, holding a wooden horse, Anna and Tommy. A sudden crack echoed from the distant hills, thunder or rockfall. Daniel flinched. His hand flew to the stock of the repeater rifle scabbarded on his saddle. It was an old cavalry issue, heavy and reliable. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, the sound of drums pounding in his ears, ghost drums. He breathed out slowly, forcing his hand away from the gun. There was nothing there, just the wind, just the empty, hateful silence. The territory was on edge. He could feel it when he rode into town for supplies. The talk in the saloon was no longer about rain or beef prices, but about the Apache. There were rumors of Victorio or Geronimo moving bands through the Dragoon Mountains, of raids on isolated homesteads. And there was the other talk, the darker talk of the cattlemen who wanted the range clear. "Drive them out," Roy Dugan had said, slamming a fist onto the bar counter 3 days ago. "Every last one, man, woman, and child. The army is too soft. We need to clear the brush ourselves." Daniel had said nothing then, just paid for his flour and coffee and left. He had been a scout once, years ago. He had ridden with the soldiers, guided them to the hidden springs and the rancherias. He knew what clearing the brush meant. It meant blood on the rocks and smoke rising in columns that could be seen for 20 miles. He had quit that life, but the guilt stuck to him like a second skin. He mounted the mare again and continued riding. 2 miles west, the wire was not leaning. It was cut. Daniel stared down at the severed strands, the ends bright and sharp where the cutters had bitten through. Hoof prints churned the dust on the other side, unshod ponies, and the deeper, cloven tracks of cattle. His cattle. He did not curse. He did not have the energy for anger, only a cold, heavy resignation. He spurred the mare through the gap, his eyes locked on the ground. The trail was easy to read, even in the hard-packed wash. 5, maybe 6 riders, driving 10 head of steers. They were moving fast, pushing the animals hard toward the broken country of the Dragon's Tooth Hills. He tracked them for 3 hours. The sun began its slow descent, turning the light brassy and harsh. The land grew wilder, the juniper trees sparse and twisted, clinging to rock ledges. He saw a small campsite in a dry creek bed, abandoned in haste. A circle of stones, a few scattered bones of a rabbit, a piece of torn rawhide, They had not stayed long. They were running. Daniel checked the load in his rifle. He loosened the Colt revolver in the holster at his hip. He was one man against 6, but he knew the land, and he knew how they rode. He would not engage them if he could help it. He would wait for night, spook the herd, and try to turn the cattle back. It was a fool's errand, risking his life for 10 steers. But the cattle were all he had. They were the reason he woke up in the morning. Without the ranch, he was just a man with a pocket full of ghosts. As he crested a ridge, he saw the vultures. They were a slow, black spiral in the sky, lazily circling a narrow ravine a mile ahead. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Vultures did not circle stolen cattle unless the cattle were dead. And if the cattle were dead, the thieves had been stopped. He approached the ravine slowly, keeping to the skyline, using the rocks for cover. The wind shifted, blowing up from the canyon floor. It brought a smell that made the mare toss her head and snort in fear. It was the smell of a butcher shop in August, the smell of copper and rot. Daniel tied the horse to a scrub oak and advanced on foot, his rifle cradled in his arms. He moved silently, his boots finding the quiet places between the gravel. He peered over the rim of the ravine. It was not a campsite anymore. It was a slaughterhouse. The Apache raiders had been caught in a box canyon, likely stopping to rest the animals. The attack had come from the high ground. Where Daniel stood now, he could see the brass shell casings scattered in the dirt near his feet. 45-70 government loads, soldiers. Below, the carnage was absolute. The 10 steers lay bloated and shot, killed to deny them to the enemy. But the men were there too, and not just men. Daniel slid down the scree slope, his boots sliding in the loose rock. The silence here was heavy, buzzing with the sound of 1,000 flies. He walked among the bodies. There were 7 Apaches, 4 warriors, stripped of their weapons and most of their clothing. 2 women, 1 child, a boy no older than 6. He stopped by the boy. The small body was twisted, lying half under a dead horse. Daniel looked away, a wave of nausea rolling over him. He remembered the fire. He remembered Tommy's small wooden horse found in the ashes. They did not have to kill the boy, he thought, the old hatred for the uniform rising in his throat. They did not have to kill the cattle. He walked through the camp, checking for life. Though he expected none, the soldiers had been thorough. They had ridden down, put bullets in the wounded, and ridden out. The boot prints in the bloody mud were unmistakably army issue, iron-heeled, square-toed. He was about to turn back, to leave this place to the birds and the coyotes, when he heard it. A scrape of rock against rock, a ragged intake of breath. Daniel spun, the rifle stock hitting his shoulder in a fluid motion. He aimed at a pile of brush and fallen rocks near the canyon wall. "Come out," he said, his voice raspy from hours of silence. There was movement in the shadows. A hand, brown and smeared with dried blood, clawed at the dirt. Then a figure dragged itself into the light. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps 20. Her dark hair was loose and matted with gore, hanging over her face like a curtain. Her buckskin dress was torn at the shoulder and soaked dark at the thigh. She dragged her left leg as she crawled, her face a mask of gray dust and agony. She saw him, a tall white man with a gun, and her eyes went wide, filled with a terror so pure it looked like madness. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the rock wall. Her hand fumbled at her belt and came up with a knife. It was a skinning knife, the blade short and curved. She held it out, the point wavering. Her hand trembled violently. She tried to rise, to lunge at him, but her leg gave way and she collapsed, crying out in a language that sounded like stones breaking. Daniel kept the rifle leveled at her chest. He had seen wounded Apaches feign weakness to get close enough to strike. He had seen men die with knives in their bellies because they hesitated. "Drop it," he ordered. She looked at the gun, then at his face. She saw the scar on his chin, the cold blue of his eyes. She looked at the dead boy 10 yards away. The fight drained out of her. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the stones. She pressed her forehead into the dirt, her shoulders shaking. Then she spoke, her voice a cracked whisper. The words were English, broken and twisted, but clear enough. "Do not shoot!" Daniel did not lower the rifle. "You were with the raiders," he said. She raised her head. Tears cut tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "No kill," she pleaded. "I serve. I work." She gestured frantically to herself, to her hands, then to the ground at his feet. "You want. I do. Slave. Woman. Anything. You say I do. Just no kill." The raw desperation in her voice hit Daniel like a physical blow. She was bargaining with the only currency she had left. Her life, her body, her freedom. She expected him to kill her. Or worse, she was offering herself as a slave to prevent a bullet. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the high cheekbones, the dark eyes swimming with fear, the way her hands curled into fists in the dirt, and suddenly, he did not see an Apache. He did not see the enemy who had terrorized the territory. He saw a human being terrified of fire. The memory washed over him, unbidden and agonizing. The night the ranch house burned, Anna screaming his name from the upper window. The heat so intense it singed his eyebrows as he tried to break the door down. The way the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, silencing the screams. He had failed to save them. He had stood there, gun in hand, useless against the flames. He looked at the woman's bleeding leg. The soldiers had left her for dead. If he left her now, she would die of thirst or the coyotes would get her by nightfall. If he shot her, it would be a mercy compared to that. But the voice in his head, the one that sounded like the scout he used to be, whispered, "She is the enemy. Her people killed your neighbors. They stole your cattle. Walk away. Daniel, walk away." He stood there for a long time in the heat, the rifle heavy in his arms. The vultures circled lower, their shadows flitting across the woman's back. She did not move. She waited for the sound of the hammer cocking. Daniel let out a long, shuddering breath. He slowly lowered the barrel of the rifle until it pointed at the ground. "Damn it all to hell," he whispered. He safetied the weapon and shoved it into the crook of his arm. "Can you stand?" he asked. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He stepped forward. She flinched, curling into a ball. "Easy," he said, his voice gruff. "I am not going to hurt you." He knelt beside her. The smell of blood was overpowering. He reached for her injured leg. She hissed in pain and tried to pull away, but he held her firm. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the thigh. It had missed the bone, but the wound was ragged and dirty. Daniel pulled a bandana from his pocket. It was not clean, but it was better than nothing. He tied it tight around the wound to staunch the bleeding. She bit her lip until it bled, but she did not cry out. "We have to ride," he said. "Cannot stay here." He stood and offered her a hand. She looked at it as if it were a trap. Slowly, she reached out. Her fingers were small and rough, calloused from work. He pulled her up. She put her weight on the bad leg and buckled. Daniel caught her. He swung her up into his arms. She was light, too light, starvation rations. She went rigid against his chest, her heart beating like a trapped bird against his ribs. He carried her out of the ravine, up the slope to where the mare waited. He lifted her into the saddle. She gripped the pommel, her knuckles white. Daniel mounted behind her, settling into the cantle. He had to reach around her to take the reins. The proximity was sudden and jarring. He could smell the smoke in her hair, the sweat, the fear. Her back was pressed against his chest. "Hold on," he muttered. He turned the mare's head north, away from the slaughter, back toward the ranch. The ride was an agony of silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The temperature dropped plummeting as it did in the high desert. The air grew sharp and cold. Daniel felt the woman shivering. He shifted his weight, unbuckling his canvas duster coat, and draped it awkwardly around her shoulders. She stiffened at his touch but pulled the fabric tight around herself. "My name is Daniel," he said to the back of her head. She did not answer for a mile. Then, a whisper carried away by the wind. "Tala, Tala," he repeated. It sounded like the land itself, soft but hard underneath. They rode through the twilight, two ghosts moving through a graveyard of juniper and stone. Daniel kept his eyes on the horizon, but his mind was racing. What was he doing, bringing an Apache woman to his house? The town would hang him if they knew. The soldiers would arrest him. And what would he do with her? Keep her? Release her? She had offered to serve him. The words echoed in his mind. I serve. I work. Anything. He felt a flush of shame heat his neck. He was a man who had been alone for 3 years. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in his chest, but he was not a monster. He would not take advantage of a terrified woman's bargain. He was saving a life. That was all. Wasn't it? The moon rose, a sliver of bone in the black sky. The coyotes began to sing, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. Tala tensed at the sound. She was listening for other sounds, hoofbeats, voices. She was a woman who had been hunted her entire life. They crested the final rise, and the ranch lay below them in the shallow valley. It was a dark shape against the darkness. The windmill creaked, a lonely, metal sound. The house was dark. He had left no lantern burning. It looked small, fragile, a wooden box sitting on the edge of a vast, indifferent nothingness. Daniel guided the horse down the slope. The hooves clattered on the hard-packed yard. He pulled up by the porch. The dogs, 2 scruffy hounds, came out from under the steps, growling low until they recognized his scent, then whining uncertainly at the stranger. Daniel dismounted, his legs stiff. He reached up for Tala. She looked at the house, then at the vast, empty desert stretching out behind them. She looked at Daniel. In her eyes, he saw the calculation. This place was isolated. There was nowhere to run. She was wounded. She was alone with a white man who had a gun and a great deal of anger. She slid down into his arms, and he set her gently on the dirt. She leaned against the hitching rail to keep from falling. This is it, Daniel said, gesturing to the dark house. Home. Tala looked at the wooden structure. It had walls to keep the wind out. It had a door that could be barred. But as she looked at Daniel, standing tall and shadowy in the moonlight, she knew the walls would keep her in just as surely as they kept the world out. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. She was alive. For tonight, that had to be enough. Daniel walked up the steps and pushed the door open. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the moonlight. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating his weary, etched face. He lit the lantern hanging by the door. Come inside, he said. Tala limped up the stairs. She paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at the hills. Then she stepped into the house, and the door closed behind her, shutting out the wind and the coyotes, leaving them alone in the silence. The light that woke her was not the soft, gray dawn of the mountains she knew, but a harsh, white bar that cut across the floorboards like a blade. Tala lay still for a long time, listening. The air smelled of stale pine and dried dust. She was on a mattress, a thing of ticking and straw, covered by a rough wool blanket that smelled of a man. She sat up slowly. Her left leg throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm, wrapped tightly in clean linen. The room was small, spare, and cold despite the sunlight. A single chair, a wash basin on a crate, and bare walls that had never known paint. It was a cell. She swung her good leg to the floor, testing her weight. The pain in her thigh was sharp, but the bone held. She stood, gripping the wall for support, and limped toward the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. If it was locked, she was a prisoner. If it was open, she was something else, though she did not know what. Her fingers closed around the cold iron latch. It lifted. The door swung inward with a groan of dry hinges. She stepped out onto a porch that ran the length of the house. The wind hit her instantly, hot and full of grit. Sitting on the steps, 10 feet away, was the white man, Daniel. He was cleaning his rifle, a rag moving rhythmically over the dark steel barrel. He did not look up when the door creaked, but his hands stopped moving for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. It was an answer, without words. "You are not locked in," the rifle said. but you are not free to leave." Daniel set the gun down across his knees and turned to look at her. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his eyes were clear and hard. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth deep with exhaustion. "You slept a long time," he said. His voice was gravel, low and unpolished. Tala leaned against the doorframe, taking the weight off her leg. She said nothing. She waited for him to tell her what she was. Daniel cleared his throat, looking out toward the windmill that spun lazily in the distance. He seemed to find it difficult to look at her directly. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the arrangement." He stood up, towering over the steps. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could crush stone. Tala felt a flicker of the terror she had felt in the ravine, the memory of her own voice begging, offering her body to save her life. She saw the flush of color rise in his neck, a red stain of shame. He remembered it too. He was ashamed that he had hesitated, ashamed that for a moment, amidst the blood and death, he had considered her offer. "You can stay," Daniel said. His words clipped, "but this is a working ranch. I do not carry dead weight. Once that leg heals, you work, you cook, you keep the house. You help with the stock where you can." He finally looked at her, his gaze sliding away from her eyes to a point over her shoulder. "You work, you eat, you have a roof. That is the deal." Tala nodded once. "I work," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, thick and foreign. "Good," Daniel said. He picked up his rifle and walked toward the barn, his boots thudding heavy on the dirt. "There is beans on the stove. Eat." The first week was a blur of pain and silence. Tala learned the geography of her prison. The house was 4 rooms of rough-cut lumber, built to withstand the wind but not to comfort the soul. The kitchen was dominated by a black iron stove that radiated heat even when the fire was low. The floors were swept clean, but always gritty, with the sand that blew in through the cracks in the walls. She moved through the house like a ghost, favoring her injured leg. Every time Daniel entered a room, she made herself small, pressing into corners or busying herself with a rag. She watched him with the eyes of a trapped animal. She watched where he hung the rifle. She watched where he kept the skinning knife by the back door. She found a metal spoon in the drawer and spent hours when he was away grinding the handle against a flat stone behind the house until it was a jagged, sharp point. She kept it hidden in the folds of her skirt, tied to her waist with a strip of rawhide. If he tried to touch her, if the shame she saw in his face turned to the hunger she had seen in the eyes of other soldiers, she would not beg again. The land itself was a brutal master. The well was deep and stubborn. Drawing water meant turning a rusted iron crank that screamed in protest, hauling up a heavy oak bucket from the dark earth. The water was cold and tasted of minerals, but it was life. The sun beat down with a physical weight, bleaching the color out of the world until everything was pale brown and gray. Daniel was gone before sunrise, riding the fence line or checking the herd. He returned at dusk, gray with dust, his shirt stained with sweat. They ate in silence at the small pine table. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin plates and the relentless wind rattling the window panes. "More coffee?" he would ask. "No," she would answer. That was the extent of their speech. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to shift. It was no longer the silence of the hunter and the prey, but the silence of 2 people enduring the same hardship. One morning, Tala came into the kitchen to find a cup of coffee waiting on the table. It was still hot. Beside it lay her second dress, the one she had been wearing in the ravine. It had been torn at the hem. Now, it was mended. The stitches were large and clumsy, black thread pulling the brown fabric together in a pucker. But it was whole. She ran her thumb over the rough stitching. He had done this by lamplight, with his large, scarred hands, while she slept. 2 days later, she was carrying a bucket of slop to the hogs he kept in a pen behind the barn. Her leg caught on a root, and pain shot up her hip, white and hot. She gasped and stumbled, the bucket slipping from her grip. Before it hit the ground, a hand caught the bale. Daniel was there. He did not speak. He did not scold her for her clumsiness. He simply took the heavy bucket from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. His skin was rough, calloused, and hot. He walked to the pen and poured the slop, then returned the empty bucket to her. "Careful with the leg," he said, and turned back to his work. Tala watched him go. She touched the spot on her hand where he had brushed her. He was a hard man, a man of violence. She had seen the soldier boots, the rifle, but there was a quietness in him that confused her. He did not shout. He did not drink, until he was mean. He treated the horses with a firm, gentle hand. She began to look for ways to pay the debt that was not a debt. She found a set of old harness in the barn, the leather dried and cracking, a strap broken. She took it to the porch and worked the leather with grease she rendered from bacon fat. She used an awl and sinew she found in his supplies to stitch the break, her fingers moving with a skill born of necessity. When Daniel found it hanging on the peg, repaired and supple, he stopped and looked at it for a long time. He nodded to her, a single, sharp dip of his chin. It was more praise than if he had spoken 100 words. Daniel suffered from a pain in his shoulder. She saw him rubbing it in the evenings, grimacing when he lifted the coffee pot. It was an old injury, a deep ache that came with the cold nights. Tala went to the creek bed, where the sparse willows grew. She found the creosote bush and the sage. She boiled the leaves into a dark, pungent poultice. That night, she set the bowl on the table. "For pain," she said, gesturing to his shoulder. Daniel looked at the green sludge, then at her. "Apache medicine?" "Good medicine," she said. He hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the shoulder. The skin was pale below the tan line, and a jagged white scar ran across the muscle. Tala applied the poultice, her fingers working the heat into the flesh. He tensed at her touch, his breath catching, but he did not pull away. When she was done, he moved the arm. The stiffness was gone. "Thank you," he said softly. The fragile truce held until the day the bay gelding panicked. It was a young horse, skittish and half wild. Daniel was trying to shoe it in the corral. The horse reared, eyes rolling white, striking out with iron-shod hooves. Daniel shouted, waving his hat, but the animal only grew more frantic, backing into the rails, threatening to break a leg. Tala was watching from the porch. She saw Daniel grab for a rope, his frustration mounting. She dropped the broom she was holding and limped to the corral. "No," she called out. "No shout." Daniel turned, sweat dripping from his nose. "Get back, Tala! He is crazy!" Tala slipped between the rails. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at the horse. She made a low sound in her throat, a humming vibration that was more breath than noise. She walked forward slowly, her eyes lowered, her body relaxed. The horse snorted, ears pinned back, trembling. Tala did not stop. She reached out a hand, palm up. She continued the sound. The horse flicked an ear. She moved closer until she could smell the animal's fear. She touched the velvet nose, then moved her hand up to the forelock. Scratching firmly behind the ears, the horse let out a long, shuddering sigh and dropped its head. Daniel stood by the fence, the rope dangling from his hand, watching in disbelief. The woman who had been a trembling heap in the ravine now stood commanding 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle with nothing but a touch. "He is afraid of the hammer," Tala said, stroking the horse's neck. "Show him the hammer. Slow." Daniel picked up the hammer slowly. The horse flinched, but Tala murmured to it, holding it steady. They shod the horse together in the dust and heat. And when they were done, Daniel looked at her with a new expression. It was respect. "You have a way with them," he said. "Horses have honest hearts." She said, "Men are harder." A week later, the supplies ran low. The flour barrel was empty, and the coffee was gone. Daniel announced he was going to town. "Get in the wagon," he said. Tala froze. "Town? I need help loading," he said. "And you need boots. That leg is healing, but you cannot walk the ranch in those moccasins." "People see," she whispered. "They will see a Mexican girl," Daniel said. his jaw set. "Cover your hair. Keep your head down." "Do not speak English." He tossed her a dark shawl. Tala wrapped it around her head, shadowing her face. She climbed onto the wagon seat, feeling the sharpened spoon pressing against her hip. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to a single muddy street. It was noisy. Dogs barked, wagons clattered, and men shouted from the boardwalks. To Tala, after the silence of the ranch, it was a chaotic assault. She shrank into the shawl, making herself invisible. Daniel parked the wagon in front of the general store. "Stay close," he ordered. They walked inside. The store smelled of pickle brine, tobacco, and dry goods. 2 men were leaning against the counter, talking to the proprietor. One of them was a thick-set man with a face like a slab of beef. Roy Dugan. The conversation stopped when Daniel entered. The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. "Daniel," Dugan said, nodding slowly. His eyes flicked to Tala, lingering on her dark skin. The shawl, the way she stood half behind Daniel. "Who is the girl?" "Hired help," Daniel said, his voice flat. From down south, Dugan spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Mexican, huh? Looks a little dark for a Mexican." "She is Yaqui," Daniel lied smoothly. "Does not speak a word of English. I need 50 pounds of flour, Sam, and coffee." He moved to the counter, placing himself between Tala and the men. Tala kept her eyes on the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood. She could feel Dugan's eyes on her, a physical weight crawling over her skin. She knew that look. It was the look a wolf gives a weak calf. "You hear about the raids?" Dugan asked, his voice booming in the small space. "More cattle taken over near the basin. Apaches." "I heard," Daniel said, counting out coins. "We are getting up a meeting next week." Dugan continued, stepping closer. "The army is useless. They chase ghosts. We are talking about handling it ourselves. A sweep. Clean out the canyons. Wipe them out. Daniel, every last savage." Tala flinched. The words were blows. Wipe them out. It was not a figure of speech. She had seen what it meant. She saw the ravine again. The dead boy under the horse. She gripped her hands together under her shawl until her nails cut into her palms. Her face remained a mask of stone. "I have got fences to mend." "Roy," Daniel said, "do not have time for passes." "You might want to make time," Dugan said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You live out there on the edge. You are exposed, unless you have got some reason to think they won't hit you." It was an accusation. Daniel turned slowly, his hand resting near his hip. "I take care of my own. Roy. Always have?" "Sure," Dugan said, smiling without humor. "Just be careful who you call your own. Hayes, some things do not mix." Daniel took the sack of flour. "Come on," he said to Tala. They walked out into the sunlight. Tala felt the eyes of the town on her back. 100 unseen enemies. She climbed into the wagon, her hands shaking. Daniel whipped the horses into a trot, driving out of town faster than usual. He did not speak for 5 miles. His knuckles were white on the reins. That night, the ranch was quiet, but the air inside the house felt charged with the electricity of the day's violence. Tala lay in her bed, staring at the dark ceiling. She could not sleep. The image of Dugan's face burned in her mind. Then she heard it, a shout from Daniel's room. "No, get back, Anna!" It was a strangled cry, full of panic. Then came the sound of thrashing, the bed slats creaking violently. "Tommy, run! The door!" Tala rose and walked silently to his door. It was open, in the moonlight. She saw Daniel tangling in his sheets, fighting an invisible enemy. He was sweating, his face twisted in agony. I cannot reach them," he sobbed, the sound breaking into a low moan. Tala stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame. She should leave. He was the white man, the enemy, the jailer. But seeing him like this, stripped of his rifle and his stoicism, he was just a man haunted by fire. She felt a strange twisting in her chest. It was fear, yes, but also a deep, aching pity. And beneath that, something softer, a recognition of a shared wound. She watched him until his breathing slowed and he fell back into a restless sleep. She did not go to him, but she did not leave the doorway for a long time. 2 days later, the sky turned a bruised yellow. The wind picked up, screaming around the eaves of the house, a dust storm. By noon, the world outside was a swirling wall of brown grit. The sun was blotted out. Sand hissed against the windows like dry rain. They were trapped inside. Daniel lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table, though it was only 2 in the afternoon. The golden light carved a small circle of warmth against the howling dark outside. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee. He pushed one toward her. He sat heavily, listening to the wind. "It will blow all night," he said. Tala wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic cup. "The wind is angry," she said. Daniel looked at her. The storm seemed to have loosened something in him. Or perhaps it was the memory of the town, or the nightmares. "My wife," he said suddenly. He did not look at her. He looked at the flame of the lamp. Her name was Anna. The boy was Tommy. He was 4. Tala went still. He had never spoken their names to her. "It was a range war," Daniel continued, his voice monotone. "Not Indians, white men, fighting over water rights. They set fire to the house while I was out in the barn. I tried to get to them." He looked at his hands, turning them over. "The roof came down. I stood there and watched it burn. I was a scout for the army then. I could track a lizard across rock. I could shoot a man at 500 yards, but I could not open a door." He looked up at her, and his eyes were open wounds. "I hunted your people, Tala, after the fire. I hated everything. I guided the soldiers. I showed them where the winter camps were. I told myself it was justice, but it was just killing." The confession hung in the air, heavy as the dust. He was admitting to being the monster she had feared, but he was also admitting he was broken by it. Tala looked down at the coffee, the dark liquid trembling slightly from the vibration of the wind. "My father," she said softly. "He was a singer. He sang the morning songs." Daniel watched her, waiting. The soldiers came at dawn. She said, "Blue coats. They did not ask who was fighting. They just shot. My mother ran with the baby. They shot her in the back. I saw it. I ran into the rocks. I hid." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I wandered for 3 years. Small bands. Always hungry. Always running. Eat lizards. Eat roots. Then the ambush in the ravine. You found me. I found you," Daniel repeated. "I thought you were death," she said. "I almost was," he whispered. The distance between the 2 chairs seemed to shrink. The table was narrow. Her hand rested on the wood, inches from his. He could see the pulse beating in her wrist. She could see the gray flecks in his blue eyes. The hatred that the world demanded they feel for each other was there, outside in the wind. In the town with Roy Dugan. In the history of blood and fire, but in this room, in the lamp's glow, there was only 2 people who had lost everything. Daniel looked at her hand. It was small, capable, scarred by the life she had led. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to cover it with his own, to feel the warmth of a living person who understood the language of ghosts. The silence stretched, thick with an unspoken desire that was born of grief and loneliness. Tala did not pull her hand away. She watched him, her lips slightly parted, her breath shallow. The air in the room grew heavy. The scent of coffee and kerosene mixed with the smell of the dust and the faint, sweet scent of the sage she used on her hair. Daniel's hand twitched. He started to reach out. Then the wind slammed a loose shutter against the wall with a crack like a gunshot. Daniel flinched violently. The spell shattered. He scraped his chair back, standing up abruptly. His face was closed again, the mask of the rancher sliding back into place. He was afraid, not of her, but of what was happening, of the softness growing in the hard ground of his heart. "Go to bed, Tala," he said, his voice rough. "The storm will pass." He turned his back on her and walked to the window, staring out into the blinding dust, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Tala looked at his broad back for a moment. She wanted to reach out, to touch the tension in his shoulders, but she knew the line had been drawn. She stood up, favoring her leg, which was aching in the low pressure. "Good night, Daniel," she said. She walked to her room and closed the door, but she did not lock it, and as she lay in the dark, listening to the wind scour the house, she knew that the man in the other room was no longer her jailer. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man she could love. The dust storm that had trapped them inside the house was only the herald of a deeper, crueler season. Summer descended on the territory like a heavy iron skillet lid, trapping the heat and baking the moisture out of the earth until the ground cracked open in jagged fissures. The silence of the high desert changed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting for rain that did not come. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards through dull hides. They stood listless in the paltry shade of the mesquite, their tongues lolling. The creek, which had been a reliable ribbon of silver, retreated into itself, becoming a series of stagnant, muddy pools, then a mere trickle that barely wet the stones. Work became a war against the sun. Every morning, Daniel and Tala rose before the dawn, while the air was still cool enough to breathe without pain. They hauled water from the deep well, the rusted crank groaning in protest as they filled troughs bucket by bucket. It was back-breaking labor, their arms burning, their shirts soaked with sweat within an hour of sunrise. But in the crucible of the heat, the distance between them evaporated. The awkwardness of the early days, the silence of jailer and prisoner, was replaced by the fluid, wordless rhythm of partners. They rode together now. Daniel had given her a sturdy, dun gelding, not as fast as his bay, but sure-footed in the rocks. They spent long days in the saddle, pushing the small herd higher into the foothills where the grass was still faintly green. Tala wore a pair of trousers Daniel had cut down for her and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. From a distance, she looked like a slim boy. Up close, she was something else entirely, a creature of the land, moving with an efficiency that Daniel found himself watching more often than the cattle. They mended fences side by side, Daniel stretching the wire with the claw hammer, Tala nailing the staples home with quick, precise strikes. When he passed her the wire cutters, his fingers brushed against her palm. The touch was brief, electric, sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the static in the dry air. He would pull his hand back, catching her eyes for a split second, dark, unreadable, yet filled with a heat that mirrored his own. One afternoon, they stopped to water the horses at a seep in the rocks. They knelt by the water, shoulders touching. Tala cupped water in her hands and drank, the drops glistening on her chin. Daniel watched the column of her throat as she swallowed. He felt a hunger that had nothing to do with food, a sudden, fierce desire to lean over and taste the water from her skin. She turned, catching him staring. She did not look away. A faint flush rose in her cheeks, darkening the bronze of her skin. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes dropping to his lips, then away. "We should go," she said, her voice husky. "The calves are straying." "Yeah," Daniel rasped. "We should." But neither of them moved for a long moment, suspended in the heat and the silence, the air between them thick with things unsaid. The bubble of their isolation burst 3 days later. Daniel rode into town for salt and nails, leaving Tala to watch the house. When he returned near sunset, the mood of the ranch changed the moment he swung down from the saddle. His face was gray, his mouth set in a grim line. He threw the reins over the rail with unnecessary force. Tala met him on the porch, wiping flour from her hands. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered near his gun belt. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel walked past her into the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of water from the bucket and drinking it in one long draught. He slammed the dipper down. "There was a meeting," he said, his voice tight. "At the saloon, Dugan and the others." Tala stood very still. "About the raids?" "About everything," Daniel said, turning to face her. "They are scared. Tala, and scared men are dangerous. They have decided on a roundup, not cattle, people." Tala felt the blood drain from her face. "The army is giving them free rein." Daniel continued, pacing the small room. "They are going to sweep the foothills, Any Apache found off the reservation is to be treated as hostile, shot on sight or dragged to the fort in chains. And anyone found harboring them is to be treated as an enemy of the territory. The room seemed to shrink. The walls, which had become a shelter, suddenly felt like a trap again. "They will come here," Tala whispered. It was not a question. Dugan has been asking questions, Daniel admitted. He suspects something. He does not know for sure, but he is sniffing around like a coyote. Tala looked at him, then at the door. Her survival instinct, honed by years of running, kicked in. "I must go," she said. Daniel stopped pacing. "What? I leave," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Tonight, I take a horse, or I walk. I go deep into the mountains. They will not find me. And you will be safe. They find no one here. They leave you alone." She moved toward the bedroom, her mind already packing a mental bag, a knife, a blanket, water. Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her arm. "Stop!" She tried to pull away. "It is the only way. Daniel, I bring you death. I bring you trouble. You are not going anywhere," he growled, his grip tightening. "Let me go," she cried, fear spiking in her voice. "I can survive. I know the land. You would be dead in a week," Daniel shouted, shaking her slightly. "Look at you, Tala. Your leg is barely healed. The springs are dry, and the hills are going to be crawling with soldiers and men like Dugan who want nothing more than to put a bullet in you. You think you can outrun them?" "I can try," she shouted back, tears of frustration springing to her eyes. "Better to die out there than to have them drag you down with me. I am not letting you die," Daniel roared. The sound echoed off the bare walls, shocking them both into silence. He was breathing hard, his face inches from hers. His hand was still gripping her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. He realized how hard he was holding her and let go as if burned. "I am not letting you go," he said again, his voice lower, rougher. "You stay here. We keep your head down. We ride it out. But you do not leave this ranch." "Do you hear me?" Tala rubbed her arm where his fingers had been. She looked at him, seeing the fear behind his anger. He was not afraid of the soldiers. He was afraid of the empty house. He was afraid of the silence coming back. "I hear you," she whispered. Dinner was an affair of silence and scraping forks. The tension in the house was a physical weight, heavier than the heat. Daniel ate without tasting, his eyes fixed on the dark window. Tala picked at her beans, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats. It was not hoofbeats that came. It was a smell. Sharp, acrid, smoke. Daniel's head snapped up. Fire! He was out the door before the word had fully left his mouth. Tala followed, limping slightly. Outside, the night was dark, but to the west, near the back pasture, a dull orange glow pulsed against the skyline. Lightning from a dry storm over the mountains must have struck hours ago, the embers smoldering in the brush until the wind fanned them to life. "The winter grass," Daniel cursed. "If it hits the creek bed, it will jump the line and take the barn." He ran for the shed, grabbing shovels and wet burlap sacks he kept in a water trough. For this exact horror, he threw a shovel to Tala without thinking. "Can you ride?" he barked. "Yes, get the horses. We have to beat it out before it climbs the ridge." They rode hard through the dark, the horses stumbling in the gopher holes, the smell of smoke growing thicker until it stung their eyes. When they reached the fire line, it was a jagged snake of flame, low to the ground but moving fast, eating the dry cheatgrass with a crackling roar. They dismounted and went to work. It was brutal, primitive warfare. Daniel attacked the flames with a wet sack, slamming it down to smother the oxygen, swinging with a rhythm born of desperation. Tala used the shovel, throwing dirt onto the creeping edge, creating a break in the fuel. The heat was intense. It dried the sweat on their skin instantly. Smoke filled their lungs, making them cough and gag. Their eyes watered, their muscles screamed, but they did not stop. They moved together, a 2-person line of defense against the destruction of their world. "Over here," Daniel yelled, pointing to a flare-up near a stand of mesquite. Tala scrambled over the rocks, throwing dirt frantically. The fire hissed and spat, angry at being denied. For an hour, they fought. Time lost its meaning. There was only the fire, the smoke, and the man and woman moving in the orange haze. Finally, the wind died down. The fire, starved of fuel and beaten into submission, sputtered and shrank into isolated patches of glowing embers. Tala leaned on her shovel, gasping for air. Her face was smeared with soot, her hair escaping its braid to hang in wild tangles around her face. Her chest heaved. She took a step back, her boot landing on a loose stone. She stumbled, her balance gone in her exhaustion. She fell backward, dangerously close to a patch of still-hot ash. "Tala!" Daniel dropped his sack and lunged. He caught her by the waist, hauling her upright and pulling her away from the heat. The momentum carried them both back, and she slammed into his chest. He held her there, his arms wrapped tight around her, his heart pounding against her back like a hammer. They stood in the dark, surrounded by the smell of char and sweat, breathing in jagged gasps. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, spinning her around to face him. His hands gripped her shoulders, his eyes searching her face in the flickering light of the dying embers. "No," she panted. I am fine." She looked up at him. His face was blackened with soot, his eyes wide and wild with adrenaline. He looked terrifying and beautiful. He looked like life itself. The fear of the fire, the fear of the town, the fear of the soldiers. It all coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. They were alive, they were here, and they were alone. Daniel looked at her mouth. The soot on her cheek made her lips look startlingly red. He saw the pulse in her throat. He did not think. The restraint he had built, brick by brick, crumbled in the heat of the moment. He lowered his head and crushed his mouth to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was rough, desperate, tasting of smoke and salt. It was a collision. Tala gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. She opened to him, meeting his hunger with her own. For a moment, there was nothing but the sensation of his stubble against her skin, the hardness of his body, the overwhelming reality of him. Then, as quickly as it had begun, they broke apart. They stared at each other, chests heaving, eyes wide with shock. The silence of the night rushed back in, deafening after the roar of the blood in their ears. Daniel took a step back, his hand coming up to touch his mouth. He looked at Tala as if he had just struck her. He started, his voice raspy. "Tala, He turned away, unable to finish the sentence. He walked to his horse, checking the cinch with shaking hands. "We should check the perimeter," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the heat that had just consumed them. "Make sure it is out." Tala watched him, her lips still tingling. She touched them, her fingers trembling. The line had been crossed. There was no going back to the silence now. The ride back to the house was excruciating. The air between them crackled with unspent energy. They did not speak. They put the horses away, cleaned the tools, and washed the soot from their faces at the pump in the yard. Inside the house, Daniel lit the lamp. He moved stiffly, avoiding her eyes. He went to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, pouring a small glass and drinking it down in one swallow. Tala stood by the table. She had washed her face, but her hair was still damp and wild. She watched him. She saw the war in his face, the desire warring with the shame, the past warring with the present. He was a good man, a man of honor. He would not take what was not freely given. He would remember the ravine, her plea, her offer of servitude. He would think this was part of the bargain. She could not let him think that. She walked around the table until she stood in front of him. He looked at the floor. "Daniel," she said. He looked up. His eyes were tortured. "It was a mistake. Tala, the fire, the heat. I should not have—" "Do you want me?" she asked. The question was simple. Stripping away all the defenses, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. "God help me. Yes, then take me," she whispered. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He looked at her with a mix of longing and horror. "No, not like that. Not because you think you owe me. Not because you are afraid I will turn you out if you don't. I am not that man. Tala, I will not be that man. I know you are not, she said, stepping closer. I offered myself in the ravine to save my life. I was a slave then. I was afraid. She reached out and took his hand. It was calloused and rough, trembling slightly. She placed it against her waist. I am not afraid now, she said, her voice steady. I do not offer this for a roof, or for food, or for safety. She looked deep into his eyes, letting him see the truth of it. I want you, Daniel, because you are the man who patched my dress, because you are the man who carries the water when I am tired, because when you kiss me, I forget the fire. Daniel stared at her, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of obligation. He saw only the dark, honest depth of her eyes. Tala, he breathed, her name sounding like a prayer. It is my choice, she insisted, her voice dropping to a murmur. Do not say no to my choice. The resistance went out of him. He let out a long breath, a sound of surrender. He stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. He lifted his other hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. If we do this, he said, his voice thick with emotion, there is no going back. You understand? The world, they will hate us for it. Let them hate, Tala said fiercely. They do not know this. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. She rose on her tiptoes to meet him. This kiss was different. It was slow, deliberate. It was a question and an answer. His lips were soft, reverent. He kissed her as if she were something precious, something breakable that he wanted to hold together. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her not to her small room, but to his own. The room with the double bed, the room where he had wrestled with his ghosts. He set her down gently. The moonlight spilled across the quilt. They undressed each other in the semi-darkness, hands fumbling with buttons and laces, skin revealing itself in patches of pale and bronze. When skin touched skin, the shock of it was absolute. He was hard and scarred, a landscape of muscle and bone. She was soft but strong. A willow that bent but did not break. He made love to her with a terrifying tenderness. He held back his own strength, terrified of hurting her, terrified of reminding her of violence. But she met him with a fierce need, pulling him down, wrapping her legs around him, anchoring him to the earth. In the dark, the boundaries dissolved. There was no white rancher, no Apache woman. There was no history of blood. There was only the friction of bodies, the shared breath, the salt of sweat, and the cry of release that shattered the silence of the house. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the sheet pulled up to their waists. Daniel held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. He listened to her breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep. He felt a peace he had not known since before the fire. The ghosts were quiet tonight. In the days that followed, the ranch changed. The sun still beat down. The work was still hard, but the air was lighter. They moved through the chores with a shy, awkward sweetness. Daniel would catch her eye across the yard and smile, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Tala would brush against him when she poured his coffee, her hand lingering on his shoulder. They teased each other. You hammer like a blacksmith, she told him one day as he fixed a gate. No finesse. And you cook beans like they are revenge, he retorted, grinning as she swatted him with a rag. They were lovers discovering each other in the daylight. They were building a world inside the fence line where the hate of the territory could not reach them. But the fence line was just wire and wood. It could not stop eyes from seeing. A week later, a rider crested the ridge to the east. It was a ranch hand from the Bar T, a man named Miller. He was looking for stray calves, or so he would say. He stopped his horse in the scrub oak, looking down at the Hayes place. He saw Daniel in the corral, breaking a colt, and he saw the woman. She was not hiding in the house. She was in the yard, hanging laundry. Her hair was loose, blowing in the wind. Unmistakable. Miller watched as Daniel finished with the horse and walked to the woman. He watched as Daniel took the basket from her hands. He watched as the rancher leaned down and kissed her, Not a quick peck, but a lingering kiss on the mouth. Miller's eyes narrowed. He spat on the ground. "Well, I will be damned," he muttered. Roy was right. He turned his horse and rode back the way he came, digging his spurs in. He had news for the town, the kind of news that spread faster than fire. The poison did not move fast like a flood. It seeped into the town of Lordsburg like bad whiskey soaking into a dry rag. It started in the saloons, whispered over the tops of playing cards, and drifted into the livery stable and the general store. It traveled on the breath of men like Miller, the ranch hand who had seen what he had seen from the ridge. "Hayes is keeping a woman out there." The whispers went, "Not a white woman, dark-skinned, wild hair." Some men laughed and spat tobacco juice, winking at each other. They said a man living alone that long had needs, and if he found a Mexican girl desperate enough to warm his bed, it was his business. But others, men who had lost cattle to raids or brothers to arrows, did not laugh. They let the resentment simmer in their guts. To them, it was not just a sin of the flesh. It was a betrayal of the blood. If Daniel Hayes was harboring an Apache, he was no longer a neighbor. He was a traitor. Daniel felt the change the moment he rode into town 3 weeks after the fire. The silence that greeted him was not the respectful quiet of the open range. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom before a sentence is read. He tied the buckboard wagon in front of the mercantile. He could feel eyes on his back, prickling the skin of his neck. He kept his hat pulled low, his movements deliberate and calm, though his heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he was a man who saw it coming a long way off. He bought his supplies, coffee, flour, a box of cartridges, with quick efficiency. The shopkeeper, a man named Silas, who had always been friendly, would not meet his eyes. Silas counted out the change with trembling fingers and pushed the coins across the counter without a word. Daniel swept the coins into his pocket and turned to leave. The doorway was blocked. Roy Dugan stood there, filling the frame. He was a big man, running to fat now, but with the hard, mean strength of a bull. Behind him stood 2 others, Miller, the thin-faced hand from the bar T, and a drifter named Vance, who hired out his gun for range disputes. "Excuse me, Roy," Daniel said, his voice flat. He gripped the sack of flour in his left hand, leaving his right hand free near his hip. Dugan did not move. He hooked his thumbs into his gun belt, staring at Daniel with eyes that were bloodshot and cold. "We have been talking." "Daniel," Dugan said. His voice was loud, meant for the audience gathering on the boardwalk. "Talking about the cattle we are still losing. Talking about the tracks Miller saw near your creek." "I lose cattle too," Daniel said. "It is a hard year. Miller says he saw a woman at your place." Dugan continued, ignoring the deflection. "Says she did not look like hired help. Says she looked like a savage." The word hung in the hot air. Ugly and sharp. Daniel felt a spike of adrenaline. Hot and metallic. He kept his face impassive. "I have got a Mexican woman helping with the house." He lied. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. "She is quiet, keeps to herself." "Mexican," Dugan repeated, a sneer curling his lip. "Miller says she moves like an Indian." "Says she has the hair of an Indian." "Miller sees what he wants to see," Daniel said, his eyes shifting to the thin man. Miller looked away, spitting into the dust. Dugan stepped closer, invading Daniel's space. "Let me tell you something. Hayes, we are tired of the raids. We are tired of the army sitting on their hands. We are going to clean this valley out. If you are hiding one of them, if you are giving comfort to the enemy, then you are the enemy. You understand?" Daniel's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. The urge to strike Dugan, to smash that sneering face, was a physical pulse in his arm. But he thought of Tala. He thought of her waiting at the ranch, vulnerable. If he started a fight now, if he got thrown in jail or shot, she was dead. "I understand you are looking for a fight, Roy," Daniel said softly, "but I am not the one you want." He shouldered past Dugan, knocking the big man slightly off balance. Dugan grabbed for his arm, but Daniel wrenched free with a violence that made the other men step back. He threw the flour into the wagon and climbed up, unwrapping the reins. "Watch your back." "Hayes!" Dugan shouted after him as the wagon lurched forward. "We are watching you." Daniel did not look back. He drove the horses hard, the wagon rattling over the ruts, dust choking the air behind him. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it nearly blinded him. They were closing in. The lie would not hold. When he arrived at the ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the hills in shades of bruised purple. Tala was on the porch, mending a bridle. She stood when she saw him, a smile touching her lips. The smile died when she saw his face. Daniel jumped down from the wagon and marched up the steps. He did not kiss her. He did not ask about her day. "Get inside," he snapped. Tala recoiled as if he had slapped her. "What is wrong? I said, get inside." He pushed her into the kitchen and slammed the door, shooting the bolt home. He paced the small room, his boots thudding on the wood. He looked wild, his eyes darting to the windows. "They know," he said, "or they suspect. Dugan and his men. They are talking about a raid." Tala stood by the table, her hands clasped in front of her. "Then we fight," she said simply. "No," Daniel said, spinning to face her. "We do not fight. We survive. There are too many of them. Tala, the whole town is poisoned." He looked at her long, black hair that fell to her waist, the hair she brushed with such pride every night. It was a flag. It was a beacon. He walked to the drawer where he kept the sewing shears. He pulled them out, the metal flashing in the dim light. "Sit down," he ordered. Tala looked at the shears, then at his eyes. She understood. Her hand went to her hair, clutching it protectively. "No," she whispered. "You have to," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "If they see you from a distance. That hair marks you. If you look like a boy or a Mexican laborer, maybe they pass by, maybe they do not look twice. It is who I am," Tala said, tears springing to her eyes. To cut the hair was mourning. It was shame. It was cutting away her spirit. "I do not care about who you are," Daniel shouted. "Fear making him cruel. I care about keeping you alive. Do you want to die, Tala? Do you want them to drag you behind a horse? Because that is what they will do." He grabbed a chair and slammed it down in the center of the room. "Sit down." Tala stared at him. She saw the terror behind his rage. She saw that he was breaking his own heart to save hers, slowly, with a dignity that made his throat tight. She sat in the chair. She straightened her back and looked straight ahead at the blank wall. "Do it," she said. Her voice was ice. Daniel stepped behind her. His hands were shaking so bad he had to steady them against the back of the chair. He gathered the heavy silk of her hair in one hand. It was warm and smelled of sage and wind. He raised the shears. The sound of the blades cutting was the loudest sound in the world. Snip, crunch, snip. Black locks fell to the floor like dead birds. Daniel worked quickly, hacking the hair short, close to her skull, rough and uneven. He hated himself with every cut. He felt like he was violating her, taking something sacred and throwing it in the dirt. When it was done, her hair hung in jagged tufts around her ears. Her neck was bare and vulnerable. Daniel dropped the shears on the table. He put his hands on her shoulders, wanting to comfort her, to apologize. She flinched away from his touch. She stood up and walked to the small mirror hanging by the wash basin. She looked at her reflection for a long time. The woman staring back was a stranger. She looked stripped. She looked like a prisoner. She turned to him, her eyes dry and hard. "Is it enough?" she asked. "Am I white enough now?" "Tala." Daniel started, reaching for her. "Do not," she said, stepping back. "I will cook dinner." The days that followed were a torment. The intimacy they had built, the sweet, fragile world of the last few weeks, was shattered. Tala wore the shapeless trousers and a heavy shirt. She kept her head covered with a hat even indoors. She moved through the house like a shadow, silent and withdrawn. She resented him. He could feel it. She resented that he made her hide. She resented that she was a secret, a shameful thing to be tucked away when the world looked their way. And Daniel. Daniel was consumed by paranoia. He forbade her from going to the creek. If she stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug, he would bark at her to get back inside. He watched the horizon until his eyes burned. He jumped at the wind. He was trying to protect her, but in doing so, he was becoming her jailer again. They slept in the same bed, but they did not touch. The space between them was filled with the jagged pile of hair on the kitchen floor that Daniel had swept up and buried, but could not forget. The breaking point came 5 days later. The coffee tin was empty, and they were low on ammunition. Daniel had to go back. He could not defend the ranch with an empty rifle. "I have to go," he told her at dawn. He was checking the load in his revolver. "Go," Tala said. She was scrubbing a pot, her back to him. "I will be back by noon," he said. "Keep the door barred. Do not open it for anyone. If you hear horses, go to the cellar. I know what to do," she said sharply. Daniel looked at her stiff back. He wanted to cross the room, turn her around, and kiss the bare nape of her neck. He wanted to tell her he loved her, but the words stuck in his throat, blocked by the fear that paralyzed him. "Stay inside," he said again, and walked out. Tala watched him ride away from the window. When he was gone, she slumped against the counter, the strength going out of her legs. She touched her jagged hair. She hated him for doing it. She loved him for doing it. The confusion was a storm in her blood. The morning passed in a slow, suffocating heat. Tala worked to keep her mind off the silence. She swept, she mended, she sharpened the skinning knife, the sound of stone on steel soothing her nerves. At 10 o'clock, she heard it. The sound was faint at first, a rhythmic thudding in the earth. Hoofbeats, many horses, moving fast. Tala froze. Daniel would not be back yet. And he rode one horse, not 5. She moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Dust was rising on the road. Riders were coming up the drive. She recognized the big man in the lead, Roy Dugan, and the others, men from town, armed with rifles and ropes. The cellar, she thought. She ran to the trap door in the pantry floor, but as she reached for the iron ring, a voice boomed from the yard. "Hayes, you in there? Come on out." They were already too close. If she went into the cellar, she would be trapped like a rat in a hole. If they burned the house... She abandoned the cellar. She ran to the bedroom, grabbing Daniel's spare shotgun from the corner. It was empty. She frantically searched the drawer for shells. 2. Only 2 left. "Open up." "Hayes, we know you are in there." Boots stomped on the porch. The heavy thud of a fist on the door shook the house. "He is not here," a voice shouted. "The wagon is gone." "Check the barn," Dugan ordered. "You two, kick this door in. Let us see what kind of nest he is keeping." Tala shoved the shells into the breech and snapped the shotgun closed. She backed into the corner of the kitchen, leveling the barrel at the door. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. The door groaned under a heavy kick. Wood splintered. Another kick, and the lock gave way. The door flew open, banging against the wall. 2 men spilled into the room, dust swirling around them. Miller and the gunman. Vance. They stopped when they saw the shotgun. "Whoa there," Vance said, a grin spreading across his face. "Look what we found." "Get out!" Tala shouted. Her voice was low and guttural. "Get out or I kill!" Miller squinted at her. The hat shadowed her face, and the trousers made her look small. "Is that a boy?" "That is the savage," Vance said, taking a step forward. "I can smell her. Back!" Tala screamed. She pulled the trigger. Click. The shell was a dud, a bad primer. The horror of it washed over her in a cold wave. Vance laughed. He lunged before she could fire the second barrel. He grabbed the barrel of the shotgun and wrenched it from her grip. Tossing it aside, Tala went for the knife at her belt. She slashed out, quick as a viper. The blade caught Vance on the forearm, drawing a line of bright red blood. "You bitch!" he roared. He backhanded her. The blow was heavy, knocking her sideways. She crashed into the table and fell to the floor, the knife skittering away. Before she could rise, they were on her. Rough hands grabbed her arms, pinning her down. The smell of sweat and tobacco and stale hate overwhelmed her. "Drag her out!" Dugan yelled from the porch. "Let us see her in the light! She fought them! She kicked and bit and twisted, screaming in Apache, calling down curses on their souls. But they were too strong. They dragged her by her arms across the floor, over the threshold, and threw her into the dirt of the yard. She landed hard on her shoulder, gasping for breath. She scrambled to her knees, spitting dust. Her hat had fallen off. The jagged, chopped hair stood out in stark relief against the pale dust. Dugan stood over her, looking down with a mixture of disgust and triumph. Well, he said. "Look at the haircut. Daniel trying to make a lady out of you?" The other men laughed. It was a cruel, ugly sound. "She cut me," Vance said, gripping his bleeding arm. "The little devil cut me." "She is wild stock," Miller said, circling her. "Maybe she needs breaking." Tala glared at them, her chest heaving. She did not beg. She would not give them that. "You are cowards," she spat in English. "Dogs." Dugan's face darkened. "Tie her up." "What are we going to do with her?" "Roy," Miller asked, pulling a length of hog-tying rope from his saddle. "We take her to the fort," Dugan said. "Or maybe we just leave her out on the plain for her own kind to find. After we teach her a lesson about cutting white men." Vance stepped forward, his eyes glazed with a dark lust. "I say we teach her right here," he muttered. "Daniel is not using her right now." He reached for her. Tala shrank back, rage flaring white-hot. "Get off her!" The voice cracked across the yard like a whip. Every head turned. Daniel stood at the edge of the yard, near the barn. He had come in from the back trail, on foot. The wagon left somewhere behind. He held his repeater rifle at his shoulder, the hammer cocked. His face was a mask of death. He looked at Tala, on her knees in the dirt, her clothes torn, her face bruised. He saw the rope in Miller's hand. He saw the look on Vance's face. The world narrowed down to the sights of his rifle. "Daniel," Dugan said, holding up a hand. "Now, hold on. You are in deep trouble. Boy, harboring a hostile—" "Step away from her," Daniel said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a vibration that made the horses flatten their ears. "I will not say it twice. She is an Apache." "Daniel!" Dugan shouted, his bravado wavering under the aim of the rifle. "She attacked Vance. Look at the blood. You are betraying your own race for this animal. This land belongs to no man alone," Daniel said. His eyes locked on Dugan. "And that woman has more honor in her little finger than you have in your whole miserable life. Let her go. You are making a mistake," Miller said, nervously backing away. "The mistake was coming here," Daniel said. Vance, angered by the pain in his arm and the interruption, made his choice. His hand blurred toward his holster. "I am not taking orders from an Indian lover." "No!" Tala screamed. Time seemed to slow down. Daniel saw Vance's shoulder dip. He saw the gun clear leather. Daniel squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The crack was deafening. Vance was thrown backward as if kicked by a mule. The bullet took him in the chest, blowing through his lungs. He hit the dust dead before he landed. Chaos erupted. Miller scrambled for his gun. Firing wild, a bullet kicked up dirt inches from Daniel's boot. Daniel worked the lever of his rifle, clack, clack, and fired again. Miller spun around, clutching his thigh, screaming as he went down. Dugan and the other two men scrambled for their horses, panic seizing them. This was not the intimidation of a helpless woman they had planned. This was a war, and Daniel Hayes was a better soldier than any of them. "Damn you! Hayes!" Dugan shouted, firing a shot from his revolver that shattered the kitchen window. He spurred his horse, wheeling it around. "Go!" Dugan yelled to the others. "Ride!" They galloped out of the yard, leaving a cloud of dust and the body of Vance lying in the sun. Daniel kept the rifle raised until they were over the ridge. Then, slowly, he lowered it. The silence rushed back in, broken only by Miller's whimpering moans near the trough. Daniel walked to Tala. He dropped the rifle and fell to his knees beside her. He reached for her, his hands shaking violently now that the shooting was done. Tala, he choked out. Are you? Did they? She threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his neck. She was shaking uncontrollably. You came back, she sobbed. You came back. He held her tight, rocking her back and forth in the dust. I am sorry, he whispered into her chopped hair. I am so sorry. He looked over her shoulder at the dead man. He looked at Miller, who was bleeding into the dirt. He had killed a neighbor. He had shot another. There was no explaining this away. There was no law that would take his side against a group of white ranchers. Not over an Apache woman. The life he had built, the fences, the house, the herd. It was all gone. It had ended the moment he pulled the trigger. Tala pulled back, looking at his face. She saw the realization in his eyes. We have to run, she said, wiping tears and blood from her face. They will bring the soldiers. They will bring a hanging rope. I know, Daniel said. He stood up, pulling her with him. He looked at the ranch house one last time. It stood sturdy and quiet against the vast sky. It was the only home he had known since the fire. Get the water skins, he said, his voice hard with resolve. Get the dried meat, everything we can carry on 2 horses. Leave the rest. What about him? Tala asked, pointing at Miller. Daniel looked at the wounded man. Miller was pale, clutching his leg. Help me, Miller groaned. Daniel, do not leave me. Daniel walked over to him. He knelt down and checked the wound. It was through the meat of the leg, bleeding, but not fatal if bound. You dragged a woman out of her house to beat her. Miller, Daniel said coldly. You are lucky I did not aim for your head. He tossed Miller a bandana. Bind it up. Dugan will be back for you with a wagon. You tell them if they follow us. I will not shoot to wound next time. Miller nodded, eyes wide with terror. Daniel turned away. Move, Tala. We have an hour, maybe 2. They moved with frantic efficiency. They packed the saddlebags with ammunition, coffee, jerky, and blankets. Daniel went into the house. He opened the heavy Bible on the mantel and took out the folded deed to the land. He struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. He watched it curl into black ash, dropping it into the cold fireplace. He looked at the photo of Anna and Tommy. He hesitated. Then he tucked it into his pocket. He could not burn them. Not yet. He walked out to the porch. Tala was waiting with the horses. She had tied a bedroll behind her saddle. She looked at him, her face set. She was no longer the frightened girl in the ravine, nor the hidden secret in the kitchen. She was a partner in flight. Where do we go? She asked. Daniel swung into the saddle. He looked toward the mountains in the south, the Dragoon Range, a fortress of rock and canyons where the army feared to tread. It was hard country, bitter country. To the high ground, Daniel said, where the ghosts live. The sun was setting as they rode out, casting long shadows across the valley. They did not look back at the ranch, or the windmill turning in the evening breeze, or the dead man in the yard. They rode into the deepening dark, leaving the world of fences and laws behind, heading for the wild, unforgiving heart of the territory. They were outlaws now, bound by blood and a desperate, dangerous love. The air grew thin as they climbed, stripping the heat from the day and leaving a cold that settled in the marrow of their bones. The trail Daniel chose was not a trail at all, but a scar of shale and granite that wound its way up the spine of the Dragoon Mountains. It was a place where horses had to pick their footing with trembling care, and where a man could look down and see the world spread out like a wrinkled map of brown and gray. For 3 days, they rode without speaking much. They were fugitives, and fugitives had no breath to spare for idle talk. They drank from icy streams that tasted of iron and melted snow, the water numbing their teeth. They ate the jerky and hardtack Daniel had packed, chewing slowly as they watched their back trail. At night, they huddled together under the blankets, shivering as the temperature plummeted. The coyotes yipped and howled in the darkness, a chorus of mockery and hunger. To Daniel, the sound was a reminder of the many nights he had spent in these high places, wrapped in a soldier's greatcoat, listening for the snap of a twig that meant an ambush. He knew these rocks. He knew how the sound carried, how the shadows stretched long before the sun dipped. For Tala, the land sang a different song. It was the song of her childhood. The smell of pine resin and sagebrush was the smell of safety, of the summer camps where her mother had taught her to weave baskets and find the sweet nuts of the piñón tree. But it was also the smell of fear. She remembered running through these same ravines, her breath ragged, listening to the thunder of cavalry horses chasing them down. "We are being watched," Tala said on the fourth morning. She was tightening the cinch on her horse, her eyes scanning the ridgeline. Daniel looked up from the small fire he had risked making to boil coffee. He did not ask how she knew. He felt it too, a prickling at the base of his neck, a silence in the scrub oak that was too absolute. "I know," Daniel said. "They have been with us since the lower pass." "Not soldiers," Tala said. "Soldiers make noise. They break branches. These are ghosts." Daniel poured the coffee into the tin cup and handed it to her. "Apache?" "Yes." They mounted up and kept riding, but Daniel kept his rifle across his saddle, his thumb resting near the hammer. He knew that if the scouts wanted them dead, they would already be dead. They were being herded. It happened at noon, in a narrow box canyon where the walls rose up sheer and red. Daniel was leading the way, his eyes on the trail, when a stone clattered from above. He looked up. A warrior stood on the rimrock, silhouetted against the blinding sun. He held a bow, the arrow nocked and drawn. Daniel looked to his left. Two more men stepped out from behind a boulder, holding repeating rifles that looked like they had been stolen from the army. They were lean, hard men, their faces painted with stripes of black and yellow. Daniel reined in his horse. His hand twitched toward his rifle, but he stopped. There were at least 5 of them. He would never clear the leather before they filled him with lead and shafts. "Do not move," Tala whispered urgently from behind him. She spurred her horse forward, moving past him. She spoke in a rapid, fluid tongue that Daniel recognized but could not fully follow. It was the language of the mountains, sharp and guttural. The warrior on the rim lowered his bow slightly. He shouted back, a question full of suspicion. Tala answered, her voice rising in pitch. She gestured to Daniel, then to herself, then to her cropped hair. She pulled off her hat, letting the jagged, hacked-off locks show in the sunlight. It was a gesture of vulnerability, showing the mark of her shame. The men on the ground lowered their rifles but did not smile. They motioned for Daniel and Tala to dismount. "They will take us to the camp," Tala said to Daniel, her face pale. "Do not reach for your gun. Daniel, if you touch it, you die." "I know the rules," Daniel said quietly. He dismounted, keeping his hands visible. They were marched 3 miles deeper into the mountains, up a twisting path that was hidden from below by overhangs and brush. The camp was tucked into a high basin, a natural fortress with a spring and a view of the approaches. It was a place of poverty and defiance. Wickiups made of brush and canvas were scattered among the boulders. Women were grinding corn on metatees, their movements slow with fatigue. Children with solemn eyes watched the strangers arrive. There were no dogs. The dogs had likely been eaten long ago. As they entered the circle of the camp, a cry went up. An older woman, her face a map of deep wrinkles, dropped the basket she was holding and ran forward. "Tala!" Tala froze, then let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Auntie!" She ran to the woman, embracing her. They clung to each other, weeping openly. A young man, barely 20, limped out of a shelter. He had a scar running from his eye to his chin. Tala pulled away from her aunt and stared at him. "Nantan," she whispered. "I thought you were dead at the river." "I crawled away," the young man said, grinning crookedly. "I am hard to kill." "Cousin." Daniel stood alone in the center of the clearing, surrounded by hostile eyes. He felt the weight of his whiteness like a heavy coat. He saw the way the men looked at his boots, his gun, the color of his skin. To them, he was the face of the disease that was eating their world. A man emerged from the largest wickiup. He was tall, with streaks of gray in his long hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from ironwood. He walked with a heavy, dangerous grace. This was Cale, the leader of this remnant band. He stopped in front of Daniel, looking him up and down with cold contempt. He spoke in Apache, his voice deep and rough. Tala broke away from her family and stepped between them. She spoke quickly, translating. "He asks why you bring a white man to our hidden place," Tala said, looking at Daniel. "He says you bring the wolf into the sheepfold." "Tell him I am no wolf," Daniel said, holding Cale's gaze. "Tell him I am a fugitive, same as him." Tala translated. Cale listened, his eyes narrowing. He stepped closer to Daniel, sniffing the air. He looked at the way Daniel stood, the way his eyes constantly checked the perimeter. "You have the eyes of a hunter," Cale said in broken English. "You have walked these hills before." Daniel hesitated. To lie would be fatal. These men could smell a lie. "I was a scout," he admitted, "years ago, for the soldiers." A murmur of anger rippled through the gathered crowd. Several warriors stepped forward, hands on their knives. Cale's face twisted into a snarl. "Scout," Cale spat. "Traitor, you led the bluecoats to the sleeping ones. You have blood on your hands." "I left that life," Daniel said, his voice steady though his heart hammered. "I put down the army gun. I ranch now, or I did, until I shot a white man to save her." He pointed at Tala. Cale looked at Tala. "Is this true?" he asked in his own tongue. "Did the White Eyes kill his own brother for you?" "He did," Tala said, her voice ringing clear in the thin air. "He saved me from the ravine. He fed me, and when the men came to drag me away, he killed them. He has lost his home for me." Cale looked from Tala to Daniel. The hatred in his eyes did not dim, but it was mixed now with confusion. A white man killing other white men for an Apache was a story that did not fit the world he knew. "Tie him," Cale ordered. "We will decide tonight if he lives or dies." They took Daniel's weapons. They tied his hands behind his back with raw hide that cut into his wrists and pushed him down to sit against a rock. Tala tried to protest, but her aunt pulled her away, whispering warnings. Night fell, and the camp settled into a tense quiet. Daniel sat in the cold, watching the fires. He could see Tala sitting with her people, eating from a communal bowl. She looked different here. The shadows of the firelight played across her face, softening the lines of worry. She laughed once at something her cousin said, a sound Daniel had rarely heard. She belonged here. These were her blood, her history, and yet she kept looking over at him. Her eyes were dark pools of conflict. She was pulled between the two halves of her soul, the Apache who remembered the massacres, and the woman who loved the man who had once guided the killers. Later in the night, the council began. The men sat in a circle. Tala stood on the edge, listening. Cale spoke at length, his gestures sharp and angry. He pointed at Daniel often. Daniel watched the proceedings with a fatalistic calm. He had known this might happen. He was a man who had walked into the tiger's den. Suddenly, a scout ran into the camp. He was breathless, his chest heaving. He spoke rapidly to Cale. The mood in the circle shifted instantly from judgment to alarm. Cale stood up, his face grim. He walked over to Daniel and cut the bonds on his wrists with a single slash of his knife. "Your friends are coming," Cale growled. Daniel rubbed his wrists, the blood rushing back into his hands. "Who?" "A big party," the scout said, switching to English so Daniel could understand the threat. "Soldiers, and men in dusters, many guns. They have a tracker, a white man with one eye." Daniel went cold. "Daly," he whispered. "He used to scout with me. He knows these mountains as well as I do." "They are close?" Daniel asked. "Half a day," the scout said. "They found the horse sign." Cale looked at Daniel with renewed fury. "You brought them," he accused. "You led them here?" "I did not know they had Daly," Daniel said, standing up. "But they are coming. You have to move. Get the women and children out. We are tired of running," a young warrior shouted. "This is good ground. We fight. If you fight here, you die," Daniel said bluntly. "Daly will flank you. He will send shooters to the high rim and pin you down while the soldiers rush the center. I know. I taught him." The admission hung in the air like poison. Cale's hand went to the knife at his belt. You taught him how to kill us." "Yes," Daniel said, meeting the leader's gaze. "And now I can tell you how to stop him." "Why should we trust you?" Kale sneered. "You are one of them." Tala stepped into the circle. She moved with a fury that silenced the murmurs. She stood in front of Daniel, her small body shielding his broad one. "Because I trust him," she shouted. She looked at her people, her aunt, her cousin Nantan, the elders. "You look at him and see a scout. I look at him and see the man who washed my wounds. I see the man who stood alone against 5 gunmen to keep them from taking me. He is not one of them. Not anymore." She turned to Kale. "He is my heart," she said, using the Apache word that meant life breath. "I love him. If you kill him, you kill me. If you drive him away, I go with him." The confession stunned the camp. For an Apache woman to openly declare love for a white intruder was a madness. The women whispered behind their hands. The men looked away, embarrassed and angry. Kale looked at Tala with a mixture of disappointment and grudging respect. He saw the steel in her spine. "He stays," Kale said finally, his voice hard. "For now, he helps us prepare. But if he makes one wrong move, if he signals them, I will cut his throat myself." Daniel nodded. "Fair enough." The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Daniel worked alongside Nantan and the other warriors. He showed them where the army would place their sharpshooters. He showed them how to create overlapping fields of fire that would trap the soldiers in the bottleneck of the pass. "They will come at dawn," Daniel told them. "The sun will be in your eyes. We need to force them to the west wall." He felt the eyes of the warriors on him, watching for betrayal. But he worked with a grim determination. This was his penance. He was using the skills of the scout to save the very people he had once helped hunt. It was a strange, bloody kind of redemption. Dawn came with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, drying the brush until it crackled. Daniel lay behind a fallen log on the ridge, his rifle resting on the bark. Tala lay beside him, holding an old carbine Nantan had given her. Her shoulder was pressed against his. "They are coming," Daniel whispered. He heard the click of a horseshoe on stone, then the jingle of a bit chain. The posse rode into view. There were 30 of them. Half were soldiers in dusty blue uniforms, led by a man Daniel recognized instantly. Captain Thorne, a man who believed the only good Indian was a dead one. Beside him rode the ranchers, Dugan, his arm in a sling, and others from town. And in the lead, riding a mule, was One-Eyed Daly, reading the ground like a newspaper. They entered the killing box Daniel had designed. "Wait," Daniel murmured. "Wait until they hit the white rock." Daly stopped. He looked up at the ridge. He sniffed the air. Something is wrong. He shouted, "Fire!" Kale screamed from the rocks above. The canyon erupted. Arrows and bullets rained down on the posse. Horses screamed and reared. Men fell from their saddles. But these were hard men, used to war. They did not break. They scrambled for cover behind the boulders in the creek bed and began to return fire. The sound of the battle was deafening, magnified by the canyon walls. "Keep your head down," Daniel shouted to Tala as a bullet splintered the log near her face. He sighted on a soldier trying to flank their position and fired. The man dropped. Daniel worked the lever, finding a rhythm. He was not shooting at faceless enemies. He was shooting at men he might have shared whiskey with in town. He shut off that part of his mind. He was protecting Tala. That was the only law left. "The grass!" Tala screamed. Daniel looked down. A spark from a muzzle flash, or perhaps a carelessly thrown match from the soldiers seeking cover, had caught the dry cheat grass. The wind seized the flame and pulled it upward. In seconds, the valley floor was a sheet of orange. The fire roared like a living thing, racing up the slope toward the Apache positions. "It is moving too fast," Daniel yelled. "We have to move back." The battle turned into chaos. The smoke was thick, blinding both sides. The posse was firing blindly into the haze. The Apaches were retreating, coughing and choking, trying to get the women and children to the higher caves. Daniel and Tala grabbed blankets and ran to the edge of the camp. "Backburn!" Daniel shouted to Nantan. "Start a fire here. Burn it down to meet the main fire. It is the only way to stop it." They lit the brush at their feet. The new fire caught, eating the fuel before the main wall of flame could reach it. It was a desperate gamble. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. It was Captain Thorne, his face blackened, leading a charge of 5 soldiers up the slope. They had broken through the confusion. Thorne saw Daniel. He stopped, his saber in one hand, a pistol in the other. He recognized the man standing amidst the Apaches. "Hayes!" Thorne roared, his voice cracking. "I knew it! You traitorous dog! Fighting with savages against your own flag! I fight for my own soul!" "Thorne!" Daniel shouted back. "Go back! The fire will kill us all!" "I will see you hang first." Thorne raised his pistol. Daniel raised his rifle. But before either could fire, a young warrior lunged from the smoke, swinging a war club. It was Nantan. He struck a soldier, knocking him down. But Thorne turned with practiced speed and fired point blank. Nantan crumpled, shot through the chest. "No!" Tala screamed. She dropped her gun and ran to her cousin. Thorne aimed his pistol at Tala. Daniel did not hesitate. He did not aim for the leg or the shoulder. He aimed for the center of the mass. He pulled the trigger. Thorne jerked, a look of surprise on his face. He dropped to his knees, then fell face forward into the ash. The soldiers, seeing their leader dead and the wall of fire closing in, lost their nerve. "Pull back!" one of them screamed. "Retreat!" They dragged their wounded and ran back down the slope, disappearing into the smoke. Daniel ran to Tala. She was cradling Nantan's head in her lap. The young man's eyes were open, staring at the sky, but the light was gone from them. Blood soaked Tala's shirt. "He is gone," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "He is gone." The fire roared closer, but the backburn held. The 2 fires met and consumed each other, leaving a blackened, smoking scar that stopped just feet from the wickiups. Silence returned to the mountain, heavy and suffocating. The wind died down, as if exhausted by the violence. The survivors emerged from the caves. Kale walked through the camp, counting the dead. There were 3 warriors lost, including Nantan. The grief was a palpable thing, a low keening sound rising from the women. Daniel stood apart, his face smeared with soot and blood. He had been grazed by a bullet on his arm, but he did not feel it. He watched Tala weeping over her cousin. He felt a profound, crushing emptiness. He had saved the camp, but he had brought the war to their doorstep. He had killed men he knew. There was no going back to the white world. He was a marked man, a killer of soldiers. And here, he looked at the faces of the Apache warriors. They looked at him not with gratitude, but with a cold, distant acknowledgement. He had fought well. He had killed the enemy, but he was still the stranger. He was still the reason Nantan was dead. Tala stood up. She wiped her hands on her trousers. She walked over to Daniel. She did not hug him. She simply took his hand and held it hard. Her grip was desperate, the grip of someone who has nothing else left to hold on to. They stood together on the edge of the blackened cliff, watching the smoke drift away over the vast, indifferent desert. They were alive. But as the sun began to set, casting the world in blood-red light, they both realized the truth. The ranch was gone. The tribe was broken. The town was an enemy. They had survived the fire, but they had burned every bridge behind them. They were alone in the wilderness, with only each other and the ghosts to keep them warm. The smoke from the battle hung in the valley for 3 days, a gray shroud that refused to lift. It was the smell of the end of things for the Apache band. The skirmish had been a victory of survival, but a defeat of spirit. They had held the ground, but at the cost of blood and anonymity. The soldiers knew where they were now. The bluecoats would return, not with a single patrol, but with a regiment. Kale, the leader whose face was etched with the history of his people's losing war, made the decision at council the following night. They would not fight again. They were low on ammunition, starving, and carrying wounded. They would move south, toward the border, or perhaps surrender to the agency at San Carlos, where the rations were moldy, but the rifles were silent. It was a choice between a slow death in a cage or a fast death in the snow. Tala stood on the edge of the circle, listening. Her arm was bandaged where a splinter of rock had sliced her during the fire. She felt a hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the wound. It was the ache of a woman standing between two cliffs, the bridge behind her burning. When the council broke, Cale approached her. He looked at Daniel, who sat by a small fire cleaning his rifle. Then he looked at Tala. "We move at first light," Cale said. "We go to the reservation. It is over. Tala, the mountains are no longer ours." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "You are of the people. You can come. The white man, he cannot come. He will be arrested or hanged if he walks into the agency. But you have a place." Tala looked at her aunt, who was packing a meager bundle of dried roots. She looked at the fresh cairn of stones where Nantan lay buried. To go with them was to return to her blood, to share their fate, however bitter. To stay was to choose the unknown, to choose the enemy, to choose the man who had killed her cousin's killer. "Think on it," Cale said, and walked away. That night was the longest of Tala's life. She could not sleep. She left Daniel's side and walked out onto the blackened hillside. The smell of ash was sharp in the cold air. She walked until she found a high rock overlooking the dark valley. She sat there, pulling her blanket tight against the wind. She let the tears come then. She wept for her mother and father, dead in the dawn raid years ago. She wept for Nantan. She wept for the girl she had been, the girl who had believed the mountains would always protect her. That girl was gone, died in the ravine, died in the ranch house kitchen when her hair was shorn, died in the fire yesterday. She looked down at the camp. She saw the faint glow of Daniel's pipe. He was awake too. He was waiting. He would not ask her to stay. He was too proud and too filled with guilt to ask her to give up her people for him. He would let her go because he thought it was the right thing to do. But as she watched the ember of his pipe, she felt a pull in her gut that was stronger than grief. It was a terrified, stubborn hope. She remembered his hands washing her wound. She remembered him standing before the lynch mob. She remembered the way he held her in the night, as if she were the only anchor in a drifting world. Survival had brought her to him. Fear had kept her there. But what held her now? She looked at the stars, cold and indifferent. "I am not Apache anymore," she whispered to the wind. "I am not white. I am something new, something broken and put back together with iron." The dawn came gray and cold. The camp was already moving, striking the wickiups, dousing the fires. Tala walked back to the fire where Daniel sat. He looked up at her. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. He had saddled her horse. He had packed a saddlebag with half of their remaining food. "They are leaving," Daniel said, his voice raspy. "You should go with them. Tala, you will be safe at the agency. They will feed you." He stood up, holding out the reins of her horse. "Go on. Do not worry about me. I will make out." Tala looked at the reins. She looked at his hand, scarred and shaking slightly. She did not take the leather. "You want me to go?" she asked. Daniel flinched. "I want you to live. I want you to be with your own kind. I have brought you nothing but fire and bullets." "My own kind," she repeated. She stepped closer to him. "Who is my kind?" "Daniel. The people who will look at my short hair and whisper that I laid with a white man. The soldiers who will treat me like a dog at the agency." She reached out and took his hand, pressing it against her chest. "My people are the ones who bleed for me," she said fiercely. "My people are the ones who stand with me when the fire comes. That is you. You are my tribe now." "Tala," he groaned. "I am a wanted man. There is no peace for me." "Then we find peace in the war," she said. "I do not choose you because I have no place else to go. I choose you because I will not walk a road that does not have your footprints on it." Daniel stared at her, the resistance crumbling in his face. He dropped the reins and pulled her to him, burying his face in her neck. He held her so tight it hurt, a desperate, crushing embrace. "I would have let you go," he whispered. "I know," she said. "That is why I stayed." The departure was somber. The band filed past them, heading south. Some of the warriors stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the white man, but others, men who had fought beside Daniel on the ridge, gave a short nod. Cale stopped his horse. He looked down at Daniel. "You fight like a demon. White eyes." He said, "If the soldiers catch you, do not tell them where we went. I have forgotten I ever saw you," Daniel said. Tala's aunt came forward last. She was weeping silently. She reached into her tunic and pulled out a small object. It was a bracelet of woven leather and turquoise beads, old and worn smooth. "For the child," the old woman whispered, pressing it into Tala's hand. "When it comes," Tala started. She had told no one. She barely knew it herself, just a suspicion in the timing of her blood. She looked at her aunt, eyes wide. "We know," the aunt said, touching Tala's stomach. "Blood is strong. Do not forget us." She turned and followed the band into the tree line. Daniel and Tala watched them go until the last horse vanished into the gray mist. They were alone. The ride back to the ranch took a week. They moved cautiously, avoiding the main trails, watching for the dust of a posse. But the territory was vast, and the army was busy chasing the main Apache bands to the south. They moved like ghosts through the high country, descending finally into the valley that had been their home. The ranch was a wound in the landscape. The corral was broken, the rails smashed, the barn door hung by one hinge. The house had been ransacked, windows shattered, furniture overturned, the mattress slashed. The cattle were gone, driven off by rustlers or scattered by the noise of the raid. But the house stood. The windmill, miraculously, was turning, the blades flashing in the sun, pumping water into the overflow tank. Daniel sat on his horse, looking at the ruin of his life. "We have to start over," he said heavily. "From dirt." Tala rode up beside him. "We have the well," she said. "We have the walls. The rest is just wood." They set to work with a grim determination. It was not the frantic labor of the spring. It was the steady, plodding work of people who have nowhere else to be. Daniel rode into the timber and cut new logs. Tala swept the glass from the floors and scrubbed the soot from the walls. They slept on the floor in front of the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, his pistol under the pillow. But they slept deep, the exhaustion of the work drowning out the fear. The first rain of the season came 2 weeks later, a torrential downpour that turned the dust to mud and filled the creek. The sound of water running in the stream bed was like music. Green shoots began to push up through the charred earth of the back pasture. "The land forgives," Tala said, watching the grass return. "It burns, but it comes back." "Maybe," Daniel said, watching her. "Maybe it does. They needed supplies. It was a risk, but they could not live on air." Daniel shaved his beard, put on his cleanest shirt, and hitched the wagon. Tala sat beside him. She did not cover her hair this time. It had grown out slightly, a dark halo around her face. She wore the trousers, but she sat with her back straight. They rode into town at noon. The reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped on the boardwalk. Men stepped out of the saloons to watch. They stared at the wagon, at the man who had shot a captain and lived, at the woman who had been the cause of it all. There was hate in their eyes. Yes, Roy Dugan was there, his arm still in a sling, watching from the balcony of the hotel with a look of pure poison. But no one moved to stop them. There was something else in the silence now. Fear. Daniel Hayes was no longer just a rancher. He was a man who had killed 5 men in a canyon. He was a man who had walked through fire. And the woman beside him, the rumors of her fighting with a knife, of her standing against the posse, they had made her into something almost mythical. They pulled up to the general store. Silas, the shopkeeper, was behind the counter. He went pale when they walked in. "I need glass," Daniel said, placing a gold coin on the counter, "and flour, and seed corn." Silas looked at the coin, then at Daniel's gun. I heard you were dead. Daniel, heard the army got you." "You heard wrong," Daniel said. Silas swallowed. He gathered the supplies. When he tallied the bill, he hesitated. There is talk. Daniel, the new marshal. He says what happened in the mountains stays in the mountains. Says the army does not want to admit a rancher beat them. They are calling it an Apache ambush. You are clear, mostly. But folks do not forget. I do not ask them to forget, Daniel said. I just ask them to sell me corn. Tala stood by the door. A woman walked in, a rancher's wife in a calico dress. She saw Tala and stopped, clutching her basket. She looked at Tala's trousers, her dark skin, her short hair. Tala met her gaze. She did not look down. The woman hesitated, then gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, and walked past her to the counter. It was not acceptance. It was not friendship. But it was an acknowledgement of existence. As they loaded the wagon, a group of children gathered to watch. One small boy pointed at Tala. "Is that the Indian?" he whispered. "Hush," his mother said, pulling him away. "That is the Hayes woman. You leave her be." The Hayes woman. It was a title, a claim. As the months turned, the ranch began to breathe again. They planted a garden near the creek, corn, squash, and chilies. They rounded up the few steers that had wandered back from the hills. The isolation remained, but it changed texture. They were outcasts, but the ranch became a beacon for others who did not fit. It started with Rafael, a Mexican vaquero who had been fired from the bar T for having a lame leg. He came asking for water. Daniel hired him on the spot. Rafael did not care about the rumors. He cared that Daniel paid in silver and treated him like a man. Then came a black cowboy named Moses, drifting west from Texas. Looking for a place where the law wasn't quite so white, he stayed to break horses. The ranch grew into a patchwork family. They ate at the same table, the White Scout, the Apache woman, the Mexican, the black man. They spoke a pidgin language of English, Spanish, and Apache. They worked hard, and they watched the horizon for each other. Intimacy between Daniel and Tala deepened into something profound. The frantic, desperate passion of their flight softened into a steady, glowing coal. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch. The wind would blow down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine. Tala would sit on the step, leaning back against Daniel's legs. He would comb his fingers through her growing hair. "I dreamed of the fire last night," Daniel said one evening, his voice low. Tala turned her cheek to rest on his knee. "The house? No, the canyon. Nantan?" He sighed, a sound of old pain. "I see his face. I see Thorne's face." Tala took his hand and kissed the knuckles, scar by scar. "The ghosts will walk," she said. "We do not chase them away. We just do not let them sit at the table. You are wiser than me." Daniel murmured. "I have had more practice with ghosts," she replied. Later, in the dark of their room, the love they made was a reclaiming. It was a way of saying, "I am here. You are here. We are real." There was no shame in it anymore. They had paid for this bed with blood. It belonged to them. The winter brought heavy snows, shutting them in. It was during a blizzard in January that the child came. It was not an easy birth. Tala labored for 14 hours while the wind screamed outside. Daniel was terrified. He paced the kitchen, boiling water he didn't need, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. When the cry finally came, thin and angry, Daniel rushed into the room. Tala was pale, sweat plastering her hair to her forehead, but she was smiling. In her arms was a boy. He had Daniel's chin and Tala's eyes, black as obsidian. Daniel knelt by the bed. He touched the infant's cheek with a finger that seemed too large, too rough. "He is small," Daniel whispered. "He is strong." Tala said, "Like the ironwood. What do we call him?" Daniel asked. Tala looked at the baby, then at the window where the snow battered the glass. "We call him Jacob," she said. "But in my tongue, we call him Gashte, the survivor. Jacob." Daniel tested the name, Jacob Hayes. The years moved faster then. The ranch prospered, not into wealth, but into stability. The herd grew. The garden flourished. Jacob grew into a toddler who ran barefoot through the dust, speaking English to his father and Apache to his mother. The world outside did not become kind. There were still sneers in town. There were still soldiers who watched Daniel with suspicion. The Apache Wars ground on to their tragic, inevitable conclusion with Geronimo's surrender. But on the ranch, they built a fortress of normalcy. The story closes on a day in late autumn, 5 years after they had fled into the mountains. Daniel and Tala rode up to the high ridge overlooking their land. It was the same ridge where he had first tracked the stolen cattle, the same ridge that looked down into the ravine where he had found her. They dismounted and stood looking at the view. The valley was golden with dry grass. The ranch house was a small, sturdy square of white against the earth. Smoke rose from the chimney. In the corral, they could see the small figure of Jacob trying to rope a fence post, with Raphael laughing and guiding his hands. The wind was blowing hard, tugging at Tala's hair, which was long again, braided down her back. She wore a calico dress now, but she wore moccasins on her feet and a knife at her belt. She was both things, and neither. Daniel put his arm around her waist. He felt the warmth of her, the solidity. He looked at her profile, the sharp nose, the dark skin, the lines around her eyes that came from squinting at the sun. She was beautiful, not like a flower, but like the mountains were beautiful, enduring. Tala turned to him. She saw the gray in his beard. She saw the peace that had finally settled in his eyes. She remembered the ravine, the terror, the words she had screamed to save her life. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "What I told you, down there in the rocks?" Daniel nodded. "I remember. You said you would serve me." Tala turned to face him fully. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his coat. "I serve you still." "Daniel Hayes," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I cook your bread. I wash your clothes. I bear your children." She paused, her eyes fierce with love, "but not because I am afraid of the knife, and not because I have nowhere to go." "I know," Daniel said. "I do it because I choose you," she said. "Every morning when the sun comes up, I choose you." Daniel took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "And I live for you," he said. "Not because I am guilty, not because I am trying to pay a debt, but because without you, I am just a ghost in an empty house." He looked out at the vast, unforgiving West. It was a land of graves and silence. It was a land that tried to kill them every day. But as he stood there, with the woman he loved and the child they had made below, he knew they had won the only victory that mattered. "Let us go home," Daniel said. "Yes," Tala answered. "Let us go home." They mounted their horses and rode down the slope, two silhouettes against the blinding sun, riding toward the smoke of their own fire, leaving the darkness behind them on the ridge. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Daniel and Tala resonated with you. It is a story about the lines we draw and the courage it takes to cross them. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. I invite you to share your thoughts on the ending and the characters in the comments in English. Did they find the justice they deserved? Until the next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.